Welcome to our History channel. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, leave us a comment down below, and share this episode with a fellow history lover. And now, on to tonight's episode. September 16th, 1776. Harlem Heights, New York. A fiery General George Washington wrestles with the inner turmoil that has been brought about following successive defeats to the invading British in the Battle of Long Island and the follow-up attack by the British at the landing at Kip's Bay. Just the day before, redcoats, accompanied by their Hessian mercenaries, stormed ashore after Crown ships bombarded the defenses at Kip's Bay with a relentless naval cannonade. The result was an abject defeat for the fledgling American. As men broke from their lines and retreated, many were killed or forced to quickly surrender. The British took little mercy upon these unfortunate souls who gave up their arms, with the king's men and their Hessian brethren bayoneting, bludgeoning, and even beheading their capitulating foe. Private Joseph Plum Martin, serving with his Connecticut regiment, joined the retreat that day and offered simply that. The demons of fear and disorder seemed to take full possession of all and everything that day. For all intents and purposes, it appeared as though the American forces would suffer a crushing defeat that would cut short their quest for independence. As the militiamen and Continentals retreated to the confines of Lower Manhattan, in their squalid and dejected condition, General Howe had the opportunity to advance upon them, trap them on the tip of Lower Manhattan, and drive them into the river. With tens of thousands of royal soldiers, General Washington commanded his Major General Israel Putnam to gather the men in Manhattan and retreat north to Harlem, using the eastern side of the island near Hudson River to deliver them from this fatal follow-up attack. He flew on his horse, covered with foam, commanding the men to leave their camps, leaving their cannons and heavy equipment. 3,500 Continentals left Manhattan at 4 in the afternoon and arrived in Harlem by nightfall on the 15th of September. The exhausted, demoralized, and yet still persisting American soldiers made their camp that night at Harlem Heights, often with little but the shirts on their back, as they had left their baggage and cargo behind in their hastily made march from the city, their clothes soaking wet from thunderous evening showers that rained down upon the last leg of their journey. Loyalists celebrated as the Americans withdrew from the city, some even exacting revenge upon their patriot neighbors, and raised the Union Jack over the governor's fort, crying out, "God save the King!" They then trampled underfoot and burned the Grand Union flag. General Howe, content with the success of the day's land invasion, gathered his men atop Murray Hill to assess the situation and await the rest of his arriving forces coming ashore through the now British-controlled Kip's Bay. Washington had struggled internally with the poor execution of duty of many of his men during the struggle of New York City. This is not to say the Continental Army wasn't replete with individual acts of selfless bravery and units, such as the Maryland 400, who sacrificed their lives to the Americans' cause of liberty. But the composition of the American military during this time was one that guaranteed that a constant rotation of green troops would employ the bulk of the rank and file, with most enlistments lasting only 12 months and desertions high, just as Washington had trained his men and they had achieved significant battlefield experience. Their tour of duty would come to an end, and thus a new batch of recruits would be brought in, starting the cycle over. Washington had written a wordy composition of these precarious circumstances to Congress on September 8th. The broad letter can be best summarized with this single sentence held within it. On every side, there is a choice of difficulties, and every measure on our part to be formed with some apprehension that all our troops will not do their duty. The Commander-in-Chief would be even more forthcoming about his sentiments during this time in a letter penned to his cousin, Lund Washington, now the caretaker of Mount Vernon. In short, such is my situation that if I were to wish the bitterest curse to an enemy on this side of the grave, I should put him instead with my feelings. And yet I do not know what plan of conduct to pursue. I see the impossibility of serving with reputation or doing any essential service to the cause by continuing in command. And yet, I am told that if I quit the command, inevitable ruin will follow from the distraction that will ensue. In confidence, I tell you that I never was in such an unhappy, divided state since I was born. For all of this internal strife, Washington had endured. He maintained an outward appearance as a dedicated and enduring leader to the men under his command. Uncharacteristically for him, General Howe left the Continental General little time to ruminate on the American route at Kip's Bay. Washington had positioned his men in a series of entrenched lines extending north from the Holloway, a small valley near what is present-day 125th Street, reaching as far back to what is now 160th Street. The first line was commanded by General Greene, where he had with him 3,300 troops. The fatigued men of General Putnam's brigades lay a half-mile behind them, and the rest were positioned further to the north, near Fort Washington and Kings Bridge. Just before daybreak, the morning following the disaster at Kip's Bay on September 16th, George Washington sent Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Knowlton and his New England Rangers south through Holloway to scout the British positions, which were Holloway to scout the British position, expected to be near Bloomingdale, next to the Hudson River. After sending this detachment, Washington began a report to Congress that articulated the disastrous events of the previous day. As succinctly and optimistically as he could, he then detailed his position within Harlem Heights, confidently asserting the enemy would be met with a defeat in case of attack if the generality of our troops would behave with tolerable resolution. He then went on to temper any expectations by adding, experience to my extreme affliction has convinced me that this is rather to be wished than expected. Washington had not offered the last stroke of his pen upon the parchment when he was interrupted with news that the British were moving on the American positions in 3 columns. Washington ordered Major General Joseph Reed to investigate at once. As Reed rode out past the American lines, he discovered that the sizable British force described in earlier reports was misguided, and that the actual numbers were far fewer. Then he witnessed Knowlton's Rangers exchanging fire with the enemy. The Rangers had made it just a mile south that morning before coming into contact with British pickets, where the Crown soldiers opened fire on the New Englanders, which alerted a small contingent of light infantry redcoats to come forward and reinforce the pickets. As the number of men in the skirmish tipped in the redcoats' favor, Knowlton executed a fighting withdrawal and fell back behind a stone wall, where they poured a continuous fire upon the British. The British would continue to advance, forcing the Rangers to give up their position and dash back towards the American lines. They had gone toe-to-toe with some of General Howe's most revered troops, including the notorious Black Watch of the Royal Highlanders, 42nd Regiment. While the Rangers had engaged their foe admirably that morning, the sight of Americans in retreat was becoming a rather familiar one for the newly arrived British soldier. As Knowlton's men made their exit, the pursuing British light infantry sounded their bugle horns just as they would customarily do after a fox chase. The audacious act had roused the proud, yet demoralized Americans, eager to show they were not just a tepid animal to be scattered about. Washington had designs on exactly how to claw back some respect from the antagonistic British and elevate the dwindling spirits of his men. The redcoats had advanced upon the Americans in a way that had overextended their lines, leaving them vulnerable to counterattack. And Washington had every intention of making them pay for their hubris. The American general ordered 150 volunteers from the Brigade of Massachusetts and Rhode Island troops to attack straight at the advancing British. This movement was designed as a feint to keep the redcoats fixed in place. While this exchange was taking place, Washington ordered Knowlton's Rangers and 3 rifle companies from Major Leitch's 3rd Virginia to swing around the British, then attack them from the rear. Washington stated of this bold endeavor, "I formed the design of cutting off such of them as had or might advance to the extremity of the wood." The commander-in-chief's plan would ensnare the highly regarded British regiments, cutting them down to a man as they closed ranks upon them. As the Americans of the forward feint passed into the hollow way, the redcoats took the bait and moved further into the open. The British ran to and fro, from fences and rocks, positioning themselves to receive the colonial assault. But once the American column surprisingly came to a halt, the British began to advance on them in small parties. Under strict orders, the Americans were to hold their fire, but when the Crown troops were just 250 yards from their line, a young green officer nervously let off a shot from his musket. Colonel Wheaton of the 3rd Virginia cried out for the men to hold their fire, but his words were muffled by the sounds of the rest of the American troops following suit, and they unleashed a scattered volley upon the various bands of British troops. The effect was such that it preoccupied the British for the better part of the next hour, and allowed Knowlton's Rangers to circle around the redcoats on their right, but their trajectory delivered the force not to the direct rear of the British, but to their immediate flank. The fatal impact of the attack had been diminished by the miscalculation, yet it still delivered one of the greatest American offensive moves the young war had seen yet to date. Knowlton led his men in a charge of the enemy, with the Rangers unleashing a vicious fire. In this opening exchange of the surprise attack, Leitch was struck twice with British musket fire. He stayed on his feet and valiantly urged his men forward. A 3rd shot brought him to the ground, and he was carried from the field in agony and mortally wounded. Knowlton would then be struck by a musket ball that tore through his lower back and dropped him to the ground. Captain Stephen Brown would come to his aid, asking the colonel the severity of his wound. Knowlton confirmed its significance, but stressed, "I do not value my life, if we do but get the day." Knowlton was carried to the back of the line. Joseph Reed placed the leader of the Rangers upon his own horse. It was clear to Reed he had suffered a mortal wound, but he remembered of the colonel when, gasping in the agonies of death, all his inquiry was if we had driven in the enemy. Within the hour, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Knowlton was dead. The multi-front attack had left the British reeling, and sensing that victory was at hand, Washington sent forth more troops to the fight. Regiments from Maryland and Connecticut arrived to the front lines, then at once delivered a ferocious attack upon their cross-Atlantic adversaries. Though they were relatively green soldiers, they had no qualms in taking full advantage of being on the upper-handed side of a battle at long last. The increased pressure began to drive some of the British into the woods. Others broke ranks and headed south into the wheat fields. Yet their officers would succeed in rallying them, and reinforcements for the British arrived in varying stages of consequence, as a stand-up firefight ensued for the next 2 hours. With munitions for both sides dwindling, Washington grew concerned of a potential British counterattack, and he sent an officer to the front with orders for the Americans to disengage and return to their defensive lines. 33 Americans were killed in the fighting, with more than 100 additional men wounded. The British, however, suffered the brunt of the exchange. Official numbers on losses written by General Howe and his British counterparts were often intentionally misleading, but based on the observable battlefield dead and the dozens of large bloodstains that adorn the former British positions of the engagement, it is estimated the Crown had suffered as many as 300 casualties that mid-September day. In stark contrast to their condition just hours before, the Americans left the battlefield with a spring in their step, giving a triumphant hurrah in unison as they made their way back towards the Harlem Heights encampments. Washington made note of this marked change in demeanor, and what may have been at least in spirit, the salvation of his emerging army. He wrote, in the aftermath of the American troops' withdrawal from New York City, a fire was set on the morning of September 21, near the southern tip of Manhattan. The flames soon raged north, consuming over 1,000 homes, and only a southeasterly wind that corralled the flames near the river prevented the entire city from being razed. The British suspected the fire was the act of turncoat arsonists, and in a fervor rounded up over 200 patriot rebels. Many were lynched by loyalists. The British could not gather enough evidence to render a conviction on any of the Americans for the fire, though they would capture one of Washington's spies, Nathan Hale, on the evening after the fire. Hale was a member of Knowlton's Rangers, and the recently deceased lieutenant colonel had been tasked with developing a spy ring on Washington's behalf. The young Nathan Hale had been reconnoitering on behalf of the Americans in New York City, and the loss of both men would be a blow to the newly developed intelligence operation of the commander-in-chief. Undercover as a Dutch school teacher, Hale had been found to have incriminating documents on his person after he had been detained. Nathan Hale was executed by hanging the following day, and famously offered these last words before his sentence was carried out. My only regret is that I have but one life to lose from my country. Washington would enjoy hearing the reports of the Manhattan fire, and state he wished more of the burned, but he would never officially be connected to the cause of it, and it's unlikely he would have foregone the orders from Congress to commission it. Nevertheless, Washington had salvaged something of his plans to make the British pay a bloody toll for their acquisition of what now truly was the Empire City. The victory, albeit small, in the Battle of Harlem Heights, buoyed the spirits of his men, but it also hardened the resolve of General Hale and his staunch force to purge their rebellious desires from the face of the continent for good. But the impending clashes between the mighty British Empire and her defiant former subjects are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you for joining us on this episode of History of the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes, as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the Join button, or click the link in the description below to become a member on Patreon. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History of the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.